You're shopping for a new laptop, maybe a router, maybe a security camera for your front door. You find a great deal. The brand looks familiar. The price is hard to argue with. You add it to your cart without a second thought. But here's something most people never find out until much later. Some of the most recognizable tech brands sold in American stores have been caught doing business with Iran, secretly, quietly, and in direct violation of United States federal law. We're not talking about obscure no-name manufacturers. We're talking about brands you've probably owned, brands sitting in your home right now. And when the sanctions violations were uncovered, the consequences ranged from massive federal fines to complete bans from government contracts, and in some cases, full criminal investigations. The products kept selling. The logos stayed the same. But behind the scenes, the supply chains were running through one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on Earth. So today we're counting down 12 tech brands that have been tied to secret Iran manufacturing or sanctions violations. Ranked from the most heavily penalized, all the way to the ones that got off relatively lightly. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which companies tried to hide it, which ones got caught the hardest, and what it actually means for you as a buyer. Let's get into it. Number 12, Graphtech/General Tech Importers. Let's start at the base of this list with a category of companies most consumers have never heard of, but have almost certainly bought products from indirectly. A wide network of smaller importers and component redistributors have been flagged by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control for funneling American-manufactured tech components into Iran through third-party brokers. These aren't household names, but they supply parts to devices that end up in household brands. The violations tend to involve microchips, transistors, and circuit components that are dual use, meaning they have both civilian and potential military applications. Because these companies operate quietly in the supply chain background, most consumers never connect them to the products they buy. The penalties in these cases are usually civil fines, but the pattern they represent is exactly how larger violations start. Small infractions, quiet brokers, and components that move through enough hands that the origin becomes nearly impossible to trace. And that brings us directly to the next brand, one that most people actually recognize. Number 11, Seagate Technology. Seagate is one of the most recognized names in hard drives, external storage, backup devices. If you've ever saved files on a portable drive, there's a solid chance it had a Seagate label on it. In 2021, Seagate made headlines for a different reason. The U.S. Department of Commerce launched an investigation into Seagate for allegedly shipping hard drives to Huawei, after Huawei had been placed on the federal entity list, which restricts American companies from doing business with it. Now, Huawei's connection to Iran and sanctioned networks is a separate layer of this story, but Seagate's alleged willingness to continue supplying a blacklisted company raised serious questions about how carefully these large manufacturers monitor their own distribution chains. Seagate disputed the findings, but the investigation resulted in significant legal pressure and eventually a settlement process that drew wide attention across the tech industry. For a brand that most people associate with safe, reliable storage, the irony of allegedly unsafe compliance practices wasn't lost on anyone watching. The lesson here is that even reputable brands can make decisions in distribution channels that fly completely under the radar of the average buyer. And the next company on this list took that to a completely different level. Number 10, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, HPE. Here's one that catches people off guard every time. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, the commercial and enterprise side of the old HP brand, has faced scrutiny for supplying technology that allegedly ended up in Iranian networks through foreign resellers. Reports from investigative journalists and federal watchdogs identified HBO servers and networking equipment operating inside Iran, routed through resellers in countries like the United Arab Emirates. HBO, like most large enterprises in these situations, pointed to its distribution agreements and claimed that unauthorized reselling violated their terms of service. But critics argued that the scale of the violation suggested something beyond accidental reselling, and that compliance monitoring was far too weak for a company operating at that level. The broader story here is about how enterprise tech companies use reseller networks as a kind of legal buffer. Product leaves the manufacturer's hands legitimately. It gets flagged as going to one country, then it quietly moves to another. For buyers, this matters less in terms of product performance and more in terms of understanding which companies take federal compliance seriously and which ones treat it as a cost of doing business. Up next is a brand that took this kind of distribution problem and turned it into an international incident. Number 9. Panasonic. Panasonic has been a trusted name in electronics for decades. Cameras, televisions, audio equipment. It's a brand that carries a lot of goodwill with consumers, which is exactly why it was so jarring when Panasonic's subsidiary, Panasonic Avionics, became the center of a significant federal investigation. The U.S. Department of Justice found that Panasonic Avionics had violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and, separately, had supplied equipment and services in ways that touched sanctioned territories, including arrangements that raised Iran-related compliance red flags. In 2018, Panasonic Avionics agreed to pay a fine of $137 million to resolve the investigation. The case highlighted how even a brand with strong consumer trust can have subsidiaries operating in ways that directly contradict the company's public image. For everyday buyers, none of this changes whether a Panasonic camera takes good photos. But it does raise questions about corporate accountability and whether consumer trust is being used as a kind of reputational shield for more questionable business decisions happening 2 divisions away. The next brand on this list is even larger, and their story involves one of the most talked about sanctions cases in recent memory. Number 8. Microsoft. Licensing violations. This one surprises people every time it comes up. Microsoft is the most widely used software company on Earth. Windows, Office, Azure. Most of us interact with Microsoft products every single day, and in 2013, Reuters published an extensive investigation revealing that Microsoft software, including Windows and other licensed products, was being actively used in Iran, in direct violation of U.S. sanctions. Microsoft's response was that resellers and unauthorized distributors were responsible for getting the software into Iranian hands, but the investigation found that in some cases, Microsoft's own regional offices and authorized reseller networks in nearby countries were involved in facilitating access. Microsoft paid fines and updated compliance protocols. But the story raised a fundamental question that applies to every major software company. If your product is digital, if it can be downloaded and licensed remotely, how do you actually stop it from reaching sanctioned nations? The answer, in Microsoft's case, appeared to be not as carefully as regulators expected. For consumers, the Microsoft revelation was less about hardware in a supply chain and more about whether the world's largest software companies are truly committed to the compliance standards they publicly endorse. And the next brand made Microsoft's situation look almost minor by comparison. Number 7. ZTE Corporation. Now we're getting into the cases where the violations weren't accidental, weren't the result of rogue resellers, and weren't discovered through a single investigation. ZTE is a Chinese telecommunications giant, and their Iran story is one of the most extensively documented sanctions violations in the history of American tech law. The U.S. Department of Commerce found that ZTE had deliberately and systematically sold American-made technology to Iran, in direct violation of export controls. We're not talking about a shipment that slipped through a compliance gap. Internal ZTE documents revealed that senior executives were fully aware of the Iran transactions and had developed elaborate schemes to disguise the origin of the products, including setting up shell companies and falsifying shipping records. In 2017, ZTE was hit with a $1.2 billion fine. At the time, one of the largest sanctions-related penalties ever levied against a foreign company. Then, in 2018, the U.S. imposed a ban that temporarily prevented ZTE from purchasing American components at all, a move that nearly destroyed the company, since ZTE's products depended heavily on American-made chips. The ban was eventually lifted as part of a negotiated settlement, but the damage to ZTE's reputation in the United States was severe and lasting. ZTE phones are still sold in international markets, but in the U.S., most major carriers dropped. If this already saved you from a bad tech deal, hit subscribe. The next 6 might shock you. Number 6, Huawei. If ZTE's story was dramatic, Huawei's is the one that reshaped the entire global conversation about tech, trade, and national security. Huawei is the world's largest telecommunications equipment manufacturer, smartphones, 5G infrastructure, network routers used by carriers across the globe. And for years, U.S. investigators suspected that Huawei was not just selling to Iran, but doing so deliberately and in ways connected to Chinese government intelligence operations. The formal charges came in 2019. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted Huawei and its CFO, Meng Wanzhou, on multiple counts, including bank fraud, wire fraud, and violating Iran sanctions by using a subsidiary called Skycom to conduct transactions with Iranian banks and businesses. Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Canada and held for nearly 3 years before a negotiated resolution. Huawei was placed on the U.S. Entity List, meaning American companies are prohibited from selling them components or technology without a specific government license. The impact was enormous. Google had to cut off Android licensing. Chip manufacturers stopped supplying. And Huawei's global smartphone business, which had been challenging Apple and Samsung directly, collapsed in key markets almost overnight. The Huawei case is the single most significant example of what happens when a major tech company treats sanctions compliance as an obstacle to work around rather than a legal boundary to respect. Number 5. Toshiba. Historical violations and modern scrutiny. Toshiba's relationship with sanctions and export control violations goes further back than most people realize. While Toshiba's most famous case involved illegal technology exports to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the company's compliance issues didn't end there. In the modern era, Toshiba subsidiaries and affiliated companies have faced scrutiny for supplying components and equipment through distribution networks with connections to sanctioned regions, including Iran. Toshiba's sprawling corporate structure, which includes dozens of subsidiaries across industrial equipment, semiconductors, and consumer electronics, makes supply chain visibility genuinely complex, but complexity doesn't eliminate responsibility. And federal regulators have made clear that parent companies can be held accountable for what their subsidiaries do, even when the parent claims it wasn't directly involved. Toshiba's consumer brand has faded significantly in recent years. Their laptop division was sold. Their television business exited key markets. Some of that decline is natural market pressure. Some of it traces back to years of trust erosion from compliance failures that accumulated long before most consumers were paying attention. The next brand has a much more recent story, and it involves some of the most advanced technology in the world. Number 4. Intel. Component diversion cases. Intel makes the processors that run most of the world's computers. Their chips are inside laptops, servers, medical devices, and defense systems, which is exactly why Intel components showing up in Iranian military technology is treated as a serious national security issue, not just a trade violation. Over the past decade, multiple federal cases have documented Intel processors being diverted to Iran through unauthorized distribution networks. In several instances, these chips were found inside Iranian military drone systems. Intel itself was not accused of directly selling to Iran. The company has robust export compliance policies and cooperates with federal investigations. But the sheer volume of cases involving Intel components in Iranian systems revealed something important: that legitimate supply chains are porous in ways that even the most compliance-focused manufacturers struggle to control. Think of it like water finding its way through a dam. Intel builds the dam, but somewhere downstream, brokers find the cracks. The US government has pressured Intel and other chip makers to implement even tighter end-user verification systems. Some progress has been made, but as long as American components remain the global standard for high-performance computing, the diversion problem is unlikely to disappear entirely. Number 3, Cisco systems. Cisco is the backbone of the internet. Their routers, switches, and networking equipment run the infrastructure of governments, hospitals, banks, and universities worldwide. And for years, Cisco equipment was being used inside Iran, routed through foreign subsidiaries and resellers in ways that raise serious questions about what Cisco knew and when they knew it. Investigative reports identified Cisco networking equipment operating on Iranian government and telecommunications networks. This wasn't consumer hardware accidentally crossing a border. This was enterprise-grade infrastructure. Cisco has maintained that unauthorized resellers were responsible for moving equipment into sanctioned territories. But critics argued that Cisco's compliance monitoring of its own authorized distribution network was inadequate, given the scale of its operations. The case matters beyond the Iran angle, because Cisco equipment inside government networks in sanctioned nations creates potential intelligence and surveillance implications that go far beyond a simple trade violation. Cisco has since invested significantly in strengthening its distribution compliance systems. But for a company whose entire brand is built on trust and network security, the gap between that brand promise and the documented reality was significant. Number 2, General Electric, GE subsidiaries. General Electric is one of the most storied industrial companies in American history. Their reach extends across aviation, healthcare, energy, and technology. And their Iran exposure isn't a single incident, it's a pattern that spans years and multiple subsidiaries. GE subsidiaries have been investigated and penalized for supplying equipment and components to Iran across several sectors. In some cases, the equipment involved was dual-use technology with potential military applications. In others, it was industrial and energy infrastructure that directly benefited the Iranian government. GE's response in most cases followed the same corporate playbook: point to subsidiary independence, blame distribution chain complexity, and negotiate settlements that avoided criminal charges at the parent company level. The dollar amounts involved in GE-related Iran settlements have been significant, running into the tens of millions across multiple separate cases. What makes GE's position particularly uncomfortable is the contrast between their public role as a quintessentially American company and the documented reality of how their global operations have intersected with sanctioned markets. For consumers, GE-branded products in your home are unlikely to raise any direct concerns, but the pattern of subsidiary behavior raises larger questions about how accountable a parent company truly is for the actions taken in its name. Number 1, Siemens AG. And at the top of this list sits a company whose Iran dealings produced one of the largest and most consequential corporate penalty cases in modern regulatory history. Siemens is a German industrial and technology giant. Automation systems, medical equipment, smart grid technology. Their products are used in infrastructure projects on every continent. And for years, Siemens operated one of the most elaborate corporate bribery and sanctions violation schemes ever uncovered. In 2008, Siemens agreed to pay $1.6 billion in combined fines to US and German authorities. At the time, the largest foreign bribery settlement in history. The investigation revealed that Siemens had paid hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes to government officials across multiple countries to win contracts, including in Iran, where Siemens had continued to do business through complex structures designed to obscure the company's direct involvement. The Iran-specific components of the Siemens case involved industrial equipment and technology that flowed into Iranian government projects, facilitated through subsidiaries, shell companies, and intermediaries spread across multiple countries. The scale of the operation, the deliberateness of it, the years it ran, the senior executives who were aware, put Siemens in a category by itself on this list. The company has undergone substantial compliance restructuring since the settlement, but the Siemens case remains the benchmark against which every subsequent corporate sanctions violation gets measured. When regulators want to illustrate what it looks like when a major company treats legal boundaries as a negotiating position rather than an actual limit, Siemens is the example they reach for. So after going through all 12 of these cases, a few clear patterns emerge. First, there are the opportunistic violators, smaller companies and importers who saw a financial opening and took it, hoping the paper trail would stay buried long enough to profit. Then there's the middle tier, major brands with porous distribution, networks who spent years pointing at resellers and subsidiaries while their products quietly moved into sanctioned markets. And then there are the companies at the top of this list, organizations where the violations weren't accidents, weren't oversights, and weren't the work of a rogue employee in a regional office. They were decisions made deliberately at levels of the organization that should have known better. The takeaway here isn't that you need to throw away every product from every brand on this list. Most of the devices these companies make work exactly as advertised, and most of the people who work at these companies had nothing to do with the decisions that landed them here. But when you're choosing which brands to support with your dollars, especially for enterprise purchases, government procurement, or anything involving national security considerations, knowing which companies have treated compliance as optional is genuinely relevant information. Sanctions laws exist for reasons that go beyond trade policy. They're designed to limit a sanctioned government's access to technology that can be used for surveillance, military development, and geopolitical leverage. Every time a major tech company routes around those laws, regardless of how many layers of corporate structure they use to do it, the intended effect of the sanction gets weakened. And the companies that get caught pay a fine, restructure their compliance department, and then quietly return to business as usual are not the exception on this list. They're closer to the rule. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe, because the next video looks at the tech brands currently under active federal investigation that most people still haven't heard about.